Welcome to session number 2 in the EAIE Community Summit series. I'm Laura Rumbley, Associate Director for Knowledge Development and Research at the European Association for International Education. I'm your host for the summit, and I'm delighted to be diving into our topic for this afternoon of forging pathways for virtual exchange and online international learning. Our invited speaker for this session is Robert O'Dowd, who's based at the University of León in Spain, where he's an associate professor for English as a foreign language and applied linguistics. Robert has published extensively on issues related to virtual exchange in university and pre-university settings. He was the founding president of the UNI Collaboration Academic Organization for Telecollaboration and Virtual Exchange, and he coordinated a European Commission-funded experimentation project known as Evaluating and Upscaling Telecollaborative Teacher Education under the acronym EVALUATE. Robert is also a former member of the steering group of the EAAE's own expert community on language and culture. We're very, very happy to have you joining us from Spain this afternoon, Robert.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you for inviting me.
So glad to have you. We agreed when we began talking about this session that it would be very helpful for us to have you kick us off with a quick primer of some key terminology and definitions that you think are really important to bring to this conversation. So I would like to turn that part of the conversation directly over to you, if I could, in order to have you share some insights in that area.
Okay. Yeah, when we discussed this and doing this session together, Laura, this is the first thing I said to you, that I think that there's a great deal of confusion and lack of clarity about, what we are actually talking about, okay? There are so many terms out there. I've just chosen two here, I think probably because there's greatest confusion between these two, okay? The first one is virtual mobility, and the second one, virtual exchange. Okay, so just to clarify, normally when we talk about virtual mobility, what we're talking about is our students carrying out online courses that are offered by other universities, taking part in those online courses, maybe following online lectures, engaging with students in the other university online, and getting credit from that other university. However, what my area of research is, and what I think is becoming more and more important nowadays in European education, is virtual exchange, which is something quite different. Virtual exchange is all about getting your students in your classes, in your home university, to engage in online collaborative projects and interaction with classes in other countries as an integrated part of their project, of their coursework, and under the guidance of their teachers or their facilitators. Okay, so there are two, very different concepts, right? And nowadays a lot of people have become very interested in virtual exchange, and they've also because not only because of COVID, obviously because we were expecting a drop in physical mobility in the coming months and maybe coming years, who knows? But also because in the European context, the European Commission is now going to talk about blended mobility. Okay, and blended mobility is basically combining physical mobility with components of virtual exchange, of online collaborative learning. Okay, so I think for these two reasons, I think virtual exchange is becoming more and more important for us in our work in higher education.
So this is a really helpful way to begin our conversation. And you may recall when we did a previous webcast with Piet van Hove, he kicked off that conversation also saying, I'm not comfortable with this idea of virtual mobility as, generally speaking, as being the default concept that we want to go to, but rather virtual exchange or online collaborative learning.
Exactly.
So I'm going to jump completely out of order from what you and I talked about doing in this session to go to a point that's come up immediately in our question and answer box, which is the following. Why don't we just call it online exchange rather than virtual exchange? Virtual doesn't sound real. Do you have any reactions to that?
Yeah, I do. It's a very fair point. The problem with this whole area of research and of learning is that there are far too many terms out there for it. For example, a lot of you, especially if you're working in the American context, will be familiar with the term COIL, Collaborative Online International Learning. Okay. I come from the area of foreign language education. In foreign language education, for the past 2 decades, we have worked in telecollaborative learning. Okay, One of the first books that I worked on that I published was about online intercultural exchange. Our problem is that there are too many terms, and we are all more or less talking about the same one. And basically, the idea that of choosing virtual exchange is that sooner or later, I think we need to take one umbrella term that will cover all the others. You know what I mean? That everybody knows more or less the basic underlying principles or elements that go into this. And virtual exchange, well, for one good reason is that the European Commission has used the term virtual exchange in their Erasmus Plus virtual exchange initiative. In the United States, virtual exchange is also becoming well known. Whether there are nicer terms or more fitting terms, yeah, we could debate that all day. But I really think at this stage, it's time maybe to just all of us to agree on this as an umbrella term, and then so that when we write about it, when we talk about it in conferences, when we say that we're looking for partners, that people know what we're talking about. Okay, so that's why I think let's stick with this one term for the time being at least.
Absolutely. And, if naming it is a challenge, doing it is also a challenge. A lot of different energies being expended, trying to move forward in this area, as we know. At this point, given that you've shared some foundational ideas with us, I wanted to also offer our participants an opportunity to weigh in with a kind of an interesting foundational question that might give us a sense of what's going on in the minds of our participants at the moment. So we have a polling question that we would like people to spend just a couple of minutes pondering and answering. And the question is, what do you see as the primary challenge your institution faces with respect to providing meaningful virtual exchange, international online learning experiences for the coming academic year? Some of those challenges might be a lack of things, a lack of time, a lack of financial resources. We wonder if there is a concern about a lack of commitment among some key players, or a lack of experience among stakeholders such as teaching staff or curriculum developers who could be key actors in this process as well. I've been a bit intrigued with this idea of potential lack of interest among students. This has come up in some conversations we've been having recently, most recently in our previous summit session with Claire O'Leary about supporting students and this concern about student engagement with the online platforms that are really coming at them fast and furiously at the moment, and a concern that they're feeling a little shortchanged by a lack of face-to-face engagement. We may also potentially in our group see individuals who are worried about identifying or connecting with relevant international partners. We had also, I think, discussed this idea of the lack of ability to select appropriate technologies or identify them. And then, of course, there may be other concerns that people have as they move in this direction. We'll let our participants weigh in on this question, but as they're doing so, Robert, I wonder if you were a betting person, what would you imagine is the top barrier that might be cited here by our participants today?
The problem is that I could see good reasons for all of, each and all of them being chosen. Maybe a lack of experience among teaching staff might be a popular one.
Yeah.
And well, I have things to say about each of them. So let's just see what people say. Okay, I would have ideas to say about each of them.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got some results on the screen here, and I wonder what strikes you about how people have answered.
Yeah. Okay, so the main one is lack of commitment by key players, leadership, teaching staff, etc. The first thing I would say about there is that the idea of not being committed to this may come on the behalf of teachers, at least. From the perspective of teachers, it's very hard to be committed to something which is going to take up a lot of time and which requires training and preparation if you're not going to get your work recognized in some way. Okay, so one of the things that I always push when I talk to institutions or when I do training about this is, it's very, very important that teachers and students are recognized for the work that they do in virtual exchange. So, for example, teachers could, for example, in my own university recently, in the University of León, if teachers organize and run virtual exchanges in their classes, they will receive a discount in the amount of teaching time that they have. Okay, so they will teach, less hours in order to prepare for this. I understand that in the new Erasmus Plus program, there's going to be options for short-term mobility. So, for example, teachers might be able to use short-term mobility within the Erasmus Plus program to travel and meet their partner and plan for their partner, okay? Plan with their partner their exchanges, okay? It is also very, if you want commitment on the behalf of students, it is also very important that they receive credit, academic credit for their work. That means, for example, if this is part of your normal course, that part of the continuous assessment mark that you might award to your students for projects, for essays, for presentations, well, part of that would also be for their virtual exchange. In my classes, 15% normally of the students' final mark goes towards their virtual exchange project. Also, for example, if you're using it as part of a pre-mobility, so in other words, students that are preparing to go on Erasmus or on international mobility programs, if they're invited to take part in a virtual exchange in order to prepare that maybe they are, if the physical mobility program is competitive, in other words, if they're like competing with other students in order to get the best destinations, that they might receive extra marks or extra points for having taken part in virtual exchange. So from my experience, when students and teachers start seeing the work recognized and seeing that there's value in this, then they become more committed to it, you know?
Absolutely. And to that question of value, there is an interesting comment or question in our Q&A box, which says, we still don't know what the full effects of physical mobility on students are, especially in the long term. So what information do we have out there for the value of virtual mobility or exchange on these effects?
Yeah.
Are some of those values or those, the outcomes that we're looking for documented, and can we put our hat on that hook?
Yeah, there's about 20 years of research being done on this so far. Okay, so this has been going on for the past 20 years, and there's a large body of research out there. Laura, I'm going to pass on to you at the end of this session a collection of links to publications, to references, to websites all about virtual exchange, and people will be able to find there a bibliography of research on this. The research that we are finding is that well, first of all, that for many students that have never had intercultural experiences, so they've maybe never been abroad, this is an amazing first experience of intercultural contact and intercultural learning. Why? Because the teacher is able to provide the guidance and the mentoring necessary to help the students through this experience, to help them learn from this experience. There's an awful lot of research being done nowadays on, for example, mentoring students as they go abroad in physical mobility programs. Well, it's the same here. Students will learn more from their online intercultural experiences if it's integrated into their classrooms, and if they have their teachers guiding them, mentoring them, helping them to interact successfully and to learn from their interactions and their experiences. Another thing that's coming out of the research is that there are virtual exchanges are very often full of intercultural misunderstandings, but that this shouldn't be seen as something negative. When students have, shall we say, communication breakdowns or critical incidents, as we call them, if they are guided and if they receive the proper mentoring, they can learn from these experiences. Okay, it's very easy for students to simply talk about their own cultures to each other, to send nice pictures of their hometown and to say, oh yes, we all love going to the cinema, we all love having a nice time, but they don't really learn from this. What they learn from is when they and their partners have misunderstandings, or they don't agree on how to reach a compromise, and cultural values start coming up. That's when they start to learn from these issues.
So it sounds like there's a very important quality assurance dimension in this process as well, that the learning is structured in a particular way and learning is extracted from these critical incidents as they occur.
Exactly, yeah. There has to be somebody that is willing to invest a little bit of time in guiding students and helping them to reflect on this. It can be the teacher, or there are, shall we say, organizations, companies that provide mentors, that you can almost, say, okay, I want to engage my students in these type of virtual exchanges. And there are trained intercultural mediators or mentors that are facilitators that guide them through the experience. But somebody, you know, people need support in this. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. So this puts me in mind of, you know, something I did want to touch base with you about. There's a fabulous quote that I've referred to over the years that I think is just wonderful, which is this idea: you can be sincere and still be stupid. And the notion there is that we may have all the best intentions in the world, but there really can be some important guiding principles and foundations of knowledge that can be exceedingly critical as we move forward with different activities that we undertake. So as we did a webcast earlier in May on this subject of virtual mobility, we did a polling exercise with several hundred participants that told us that nearly half of those participants considered their institutions new to virtual mobility or virtual exchange, but actively planning to offer some such options in the upcoming academic year. If you were to hypothetically be a consultant to some of these institutions as they begin to move down this path into new territory, offering these types of programs, I wonder if there are ways, some top pieces of advice that you would offer when it comes to those pillars, the really important foundational framework for doing this work as well as one can.
Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, I suppose, and what's something I hope that is already evident, is that virtual exchange is not simply a question of match and learn. You do not simply put your students together with students at other universities and say, off you go, enjoy yourselves, learn from your experience, okay? It's the same as sending them unprepared on physical mobility. You know, it's pure luck, basically. It will depend on the things that happen to them, and it will depend on their psychological and preparedness, shall we say, for the whole thing. So that can't happen. So in other words, if you are going to introduce virtual exchange into your institution, the teachers, the staff, the faculty that are going to be running these exchanges need training, okay? They need to know about how to design good learning activities or tasks. They need to know how to choose the right digital tools. They need to know about how to guide students, this mentoring we were talking about earlier. These are things that can be learned, okay? They can be studied, they can be learned, examples can be seen, and they can be given practice in doing it, okay? And of course, they also need to know how to evaluate it, okay? But, you know, this isn't, you know, this is also needs to be discussed, and options need to be shown to people, okay? That would be the first thing, the importance of training. The second thing is something that I kind of mentioned earlier, which is the whole idea of providing academic recognition for the work, okay? Students and teachers need academic recognition. And this is something that maybe the policymakers or senior management at universities need to be aware of. You cannot expect, simply because this is online, it should not be taken for granted that this is something extra that can be added on, and both students and teachers will do it willingly without any recognition. This needs to be built into the curricula. It needs, and like I said, teachers also need their recognition for their work in some way. Okay.
Absolutely.
And then I suppose the third big issue I would suggest is that don't make this a competition with physical mobility. This is not. I've seen articles and I've seen comments on Twitter lately about, you know, people comparing the physical, the experience of going abroad physically with online learning. And of course, online learning always loses, okay? But first of all, nobody's suggesting, even the most avid proponents of virtual exchange are not suggesting that virtual exchange is somehow better than physical mobility. But it does offer other options. For example, there are many students that you know in your institutions all around the world that will never engage in physical mobility. In Europe, I think the average rate of physical mobility is 7% or something like that. It's incredibly low, okay? So what happens to all of those students that will never go abroad? They need, just as much as everybody else, an international learning experience. And this is one form of international learning experience, okay? Secondly, it also allows us to incorporate into international learning digital skills and digital competence, okay, which is something that physical mobility maybe doesn't automatically bring with it, all right? The third thing is this is international learning that is happening within the context of a classroom, of an educational context where teachers are guiding you, as we've spoken about, okay? And fourthly, virtual exchange can be considered also as a practical tool for preparing physical mobility. Okay, so now we come back again to blended mobility, blending virtual experiences with stages of physical mobility. Okay, so I really think we have to move away from this physical or virtual. It doesn't and it shouldn't be one or the other, or looking for what is better in one than in the other.
Exactly. Choices based on different factors, a continuum of experiences across a learning lifetime. I think there's some very interesting ideas embedded in all of that. And yet, sadly, I'm going to ask you a question that puts online experience against physical mobility simply because it is in the Q&A box. A question is in the queue here having to do with this notion of the acquisition of soft skills. Things that relate to culture and habitat and traditions that one might be able to argue one has at least a more direct shot at through a physical mobility experience. What is it, or what can online learning experiences lend to the acquisition of those soft skills or those sensitivities that I've just mentioned?
Yeah, I think when virtual exchange is well designed, when the tasks, when the learning activities that our students do together online are well structured and well designed, there is enormous potential for collaborative learning, okay, for developing collaborative skills. Also, my students, when they give me back their portfolios reflecting on what they've learned from their exchanges, an awful lot of them mention time management, flexibility, okay, and I suppose empathy, really, trying to realize that people are, even though they and their partners are working on the same project together, they are coming from very different backgrounds with very different contexts and deadlines and pressures and things like that. And all of these things come up in this mess that is this online collaboration, right? It is a bit of a mess sometimes. And these are the type of skills that people are constantly reporting that they learn from them.
Very good. Jumping to a slightly different subject, I wonder if in the work that you've been doing with virtual exchange and online international learning has also been affected by considerations of internationalization at home. Do you see strong synergies there? So how do you think about internationalization at home in relation to virtual exchange?
Yeah, I've always been surprised that the internationalization at home, and especially the internationalization of the curriculum, they haven't, shall we say, sprung on this idea of virtual exchange, because I think it's one of the most obvious tools for internationalizing the curriculum, giving international experiences to people that are not going to be mobile or not able to be mobile. I just think it is such an obvious match. Yeah, I really do. Yeah, I just think it's, it should be one of the basic tools for internationalizing the curriculum, I would argue.
Fantastic. I've seen this question popping up across a lot of different sessions that we've been offering over recent months. We haven't done a specific session on it, but I am also intrigued by the question about virtual experience and practical experiences such as internships. I wonder if there is, if you have some thoughts on that dynamic and what the future may hold for that kind of practical learning. But the question in the Q&A box that we see here is also about whether there's similar evidence of positive impact and learning by students in relation to virtual internships and virtual practical experiences.
The virtual internships is not something that I have personally researched. I know that there is a group of researchers, I believe they are in Belgium, I think, Ilse Op de Beek, I think, if I'm pronouncing her name properly. There are people that have done work on shall we say, virtual exchange integrated into internships and things like that. This isn't something that I would be very familiar with. I must admit now, I'm not comfortable shall I say,
Sure.
Recommending that. Okay,
Absolutely.
What I will try to do is find the reference that I remember reading about this, and I would include that in my list of references.
Wonderful. A conversation for another day, particularly. We also have a question about, so our poll asked about this lack of, or the barriers or challenges that may be faced. And one of the respondents in our Q&A was saying, you know, lack of commitment in a rush toward online engagement might come from the fact that it's too early to make predictions about what's happening in our environment at the moment, and thus we are hesitant about making investments. How long will this really harsh situation of limited mobility be with us? And you know, how long will it take to develop this mindset in relation to online learning? Do you see the current moment as really the opening of a door that is going to really push online engagement to a new era and a new level? Or do you see that people are being very reactive in the moment and that there may not be a very sustained commitment, or is perhaps as sustained as you might like to see?
Well, okay, it's a very, very big question, and it's a fair question, but let me think of how I explain this. There is definitely a huge amount of interest in virtual exchange now as a reaction to COVID and as a reaction to the expectation that there will be much less physical mobility in the coming year. That is definitely the case. I'm hoping that this will at least force or push institutions to learn more about what it is and how it works and its potential. And whether I doubt, and I don't think it should, mean that physical mobility programs will somehow be replaced, okay? But what I ideally would like to see is that it would become an integral part of universities' internationalization programs or international learning programs, okay? I keep coming back to, you know, blended mobility, this idea that is going to be in the new Erasmus Plus program, the idea of combining stages of online collaboration between groups of students before they actually then engage in mobility to the partner university. I mean, I think this is really the way to go. I think it's, again, something that I find so obvious that I think it makes sense. Maybe if one of the few good things that will come out of all of this, what we're going through at the moment, is that if this brings institutions to consider this more seriously and to learn how it works, then definitely that would be great. Yeah.
Fantastic. So one last question for you. At the outset, I was asking you to outline some things that you would advise to institutions that are moving down this path that they would do or think about. I wonder if you could flip it on its head and give us a sense of a couple of things that you very much hope institutions don't do. In the race to offer these kinds of programs, are there any missteps that you would hope could be avoided with careful consideration?
Yeah, I've received several phone calls from people over the past couple of months asking for a 2-minute summary of what virtual exchange is and how to do it. And you can hear their voices kind of drop as I start explaining how it is, and you know, shall we say, the complexity of it, and how and if you to do it properly, then you should do this. You need to train people in that, and there's a general kind of disappointment in their voices because they seem to think that there is one platform or one simple thing that you have to do to get this up and going, and this will then do instead of physical mobility for a time being. Like I keep saying, it is more complex than that. It is not simply a question of match and learn. Your students and your teachers need to be prepared. They need to be trained in how to do this. Students too need training in this. We really have to move away from this idea of our students are digital natives. Okay, digital natives is falsely understood as they are very good at communicating online and learning online. But any of the people that are listening here to me today that have tried to do online learning activities with their students will realize is that what students are very good consumers of online material and online content, right? But they're not necessarily good online communicators and online collaborators. So, we cannot assume that students are ready to do this on their own, right? So that's, again, if you say, well, we shouldn't don't assume that students are digital natives in that sense. Okay.
So in some fashion, I feel as if I've done the same thing to you as those institutions have done by calling upon you to really, cut a very, very rich and complicated conversation into something that's quite short and distilled. but this is only part one of an experience that our session is meant to offer participants. It's a preliminary conversation with you to get some of these very core details out into the open. And this part of the conversation we need to wrap up at this point, but we'll be coming back to you at the end of the session for some final reflections and some further thoughts on what it is we're all talking about as we try to unpack this question of virtual exchange and online learning. So for the moment, I'd like to thank you for what you've been able to offer us at this point, Robert, and we'll come back to you at a point a little bit later in the proceedings.
Okay, all right, thanks a lot. See you later.
Thanks, Robert. So we've now reached a point in the proceedings in which we are asking all of you to move with us to a different kind of conversation in the context of some small group discussions. We have some very specific ideas for what you may want to cover in those small discussions. The first being how you're reacting to some of the key issues that Robert has provided in this preliminary discussion. What you see as some of the biggest barriers toward meaningful virtual exchange at your own institution, and what plans you might have to try to overcome some of those barriers. So we hope that will offer some really nice kickoff points for some deeper exploration of this issue from your very own perspectives in your very own contexts. Welcome back, colleagues. Welcome back, Robert. We're now at the final stages of this particular session and have an opportunity to have some concluding discussion around the topic that we've been working on for the last 90 minutes, forging pathways for virtual exchange and online international learning. Robert, it's been, I don't know how it was for you, but completely fascinating for me to watch the Padlet evolve in front of our eyes. It was a very fast action in front of us. I wonder if you have some thoughts on what you were seeing there and ideas that occur to you as you look at that information.
Yeah, it was fascinating to watch because you have so many people writing at the same time, yet you can see definitely recurring ideas coming up again and again. What I liked about it, or what I overall, you could see that there is an appreciation that this has to be taken as a long-term activity and as a long-term part of a long-term strategy. Okay, so a lot of people mentioned, for example, the importance of including this in the internationalization strategies of your institutions. All right, that's, I think, vital, basic element. A few other people mentioned, and I think this is really important, something that I didn't bring up, but it's something really well worth spotting, is that it's very important to, shall we say, spread the word and to sell this and to explain it clearly to other colleagues in your departments, so that, because you know, many people will have a very, very superficial understanding about what, you know, what's this, what it involves, how it works. And if you want to, you know, to convince colleagues to do this, then you need to explain clearly how it works, what the possible benefits are, etc., etc. Okay. And also, there's one person that said something very, very, very interesting. A colleague said, it requires professors to think differently about their teaching. Now, this is something that I think any of you that try to introduce this into your departments are going to come up against. This whole idea that there are certain teachers, certain professors that are not going to, shall we say, want to go along with the pedagogical approach that underlies this. And this requires a lot of debate, a lot of convincing, a lot of demonstration of the proof of its effectiveness. Okay, so I found that really interesting. And of course, the thing that comes up, the basic question that many people brought up is, how about where to find the right partners? What, you know, how to go about finding the right partners? In the list of resources that I'll be providing to you all later on, there are there's our academic organization, Uni Collaboration, helps with partner finding. There is also Erasmus Plus Virtual Exchange that provides online training and also helps then in partner finding. But I think a lot of you will find that if you are yourselves teachers, if you are faculty, that it's probably people that you already know from your academic area, from conferences, from collaborating online together and things like that. These are the people that you can contact and propose these type of projects to, because you already know each other. Because trust me, when you start doing these projects, it involves an awful lot of collaboration between the teachers. Okay, this is really, really important. So, and also I think, for example, at the moment in Europe, we have the European University Networks. I think small networks of universities, of institutions coming together that, how shall we say, have something in common. These are ideal places for, you know, establishing networks of teachers working together.
Those are really interesting insights. There are a couple of things that I wanted to mention from the Padlet, but what you've just said puts me in mind of an item that was left over in our Q&A box from the plenary that I wanted to pop back to. There was a question in that Q&A box around this idea of scaling up virtual exchange.
Yeah.
And for some reason, it put me in mind instantly of European universities, actually, that initiative, which in my understanding is really trying to develop these very intense networks among institutions that are committed to a particular network that would potentially involve this kind of really close collaboration in learning, potentially with physical mobility, but also with virtual exchange.
Exactly. Yeah.
Are you feeling optimistic about, you know, that scaling up of that kind of engagement? You know, how does that look in your mind's eye as we look toward the future?
I'm becoming more and more positive about this, because I think, for example, in the case of the European university networks, I think they are obliged or encouraged to achieve, I don't know if it's 40% or 50% student mobility. Okay, and so I imagine most of them are starting off with maybe 7 to 10% or 5 to 7% student mobility. So where is this? Where are these intercultural experiences, international experiences coming from? I think, again, they will be, shall we say, pushed towards exploring and scaling up virtual exchange because of this.
Yes.
I think the key, however, to scaling up, right, as John Paga said, was, you know, I think is the key is recognition, promotion, prestige, that, you know, that it's not individual teachers that are doing this on their own all the time. For, you know, it has to be, there has to be a top-down approach as well. I think that's really important, where you have university management supporting, promoting, providing training, providing, like I said, some kind of recognition for teachers who go to the trouble of learning how to do this.
Absolutely, and infrastructure has to support that, right? If it's going to be an extensive connection. So the flip side of that actually is another point that was made on the Padlet that actually also came up in our morning session around student engagement and support, and that is this notion of digital fatigue. So we have this brave new world of a great deal of online engagement, but a lot of that has happened very quickly in the last couple of months to scale. Do you have some thoughts on that notion of digital fatigue? And is that something that we need to be concerned about as we're moving forward into the next academic year, for example?
Yeah, I think that may be an issue now because of the very, very strange circumstances we're after experiencing. All I would say is that until now, this hasn't been an issue, in the sense that students that do virtual exchange, when I do it, for example, my classes, it normally doesn't happen during class time. It happens, you know, as part of their, shall we say, their homework, their out of class activities. Okay, so, and in virtual exchange, there are stages that have to happen online, obviously, where the collaboration happens. But a very important part is the reflection and the learning and the preparing for the actual online interaction, you know, and all of that is happening offline, you know. So I wouldn't worry too much. I think once these famous exceptional circumstances have passed, this will stop being an issue again, I think.
Great. So a couple more questions before we're getting to the end of our time here. In the Q&A box, which we had left behind in the plenary, there was a question about any indication you could share of quality frameworks to assess quality of these new dynamics, or not necessarily new, but virtual or blended mobility. Any thoughts on that?
Well, there's lots. Obviously, this is, you know, as soon as something like this begins to happen, people start asking, well, how do we know it works? Or what are the learning outcomes? How does that work? So, for example, this European project policy experiment that we've just finished, the Evaluate project, we looked at the impact of virtual exchange on over 1,000 student teachers, okay, students of education that were preparing to become teachers, and we engaged them in virtual exchange together. And we looked at the impact on digital competences, intercultural competences, foreign language competence development. So that study is free. It's online. It's in the list of resources that I'll be sharing with you as well. There's also an important organization in the United States called the Stevens Initiative. I'm going to put the link into the chat here. And Stevens have come up with a list of what they call a toolkit with different measuring tools, shall we say, for intercultural competence development through online exchanges and things like that. Okay, so there's lots of resources there. Okay,
Fabulous.
there are many organizations, many initiatives, projects that are investigating the impact of this. The Evolve project, for example, is another European project that is currently looking at the impact of virtual exchange. And you know, all you have to, I think, is Googling them, and obviously the list of resources that I'll be providing as well.
Fantastic. So we're very close to the end of our time now, and I wanted to reiterate what you have said several times. The list of resources, the handout that you've created so graciously for us, will be provided to all participants in the aftermath of this session and the summit itself, as will the Padlet. And I'd like to make a special mention that the Padlet will be open actually through the end of the summit. So in the next 24 hours, as people have additional thoughts, would like to peruse it a little more calmly and quietly in their own time, it will be available. And once we close it out, those resources will be shared with our registered participants. Robert, is there any final quick thing that you might want to share as a last thought before we say our goodbye to you?
Yeah, you warned me you were going to ask me this, okay? And I've been thinking, trying to put my thoughts together, say, you know, how do I sum all of this up? I suppose one message I would say that if you're a teacher, worry more about the pedagogy than the technology, okay? Very often teachers are put off by this because maybe you feel they are not very comfortable using online technologies. I find that the projects that are a success, it is because the teachers have used good pedagogy, with good tasks, and have integrated into their lessons and have supported their students. Okay, and if you're a university decision maker, so to speak, a university manager, then give teachers and students the recognition that this work deserves. Okay, and that would be the key to success.
Wonderful. I can't imagine a better way to summarize these issues. Thank you so much, Robert. We appreciate your expertise and time so very much, and we hope to have you back in future events when we're talking on this issue.